I've trained you to the point of death.
Before anyone argued online about canon, adaptations, or changes between the screen and the page, the story of Interview with the Vampire already carried a deep and unmistakable queer legacy. Anne Rice created the novel during a time when queer themes were often coded or softened in literature. She wrote Louis and Lestat as a pair locked in a dark emotional marriage, a partnership built on possession, longing, resentment, and an intimacy that stretched through centuries. When the screenplay moved into production in the early 90s, studios worried that the film might be too queer for a mainstream audience. Yet the novel's core relationships were too iconic to strip away. The movie became an unusual cultural moment. It was a big-budget gothic drama led by two of the most famous men in Hollywood, and yet the heart of the story was still built on queer desire, queer domestic life, and queer heartbreak. Viewers felt it even if they did not have the language for it. Critics at the time danced around the topic because the industry rarely acknowledged queer subtext openly, but later reviews and academic articles confirmed what fans had known from the start. The queer tension in the film was not accidental. It was baked into the story from the first draft of the novel. The film created a world where vampires lived outside human rules, outside traditional ideas of marriage and family, and outside the expectations of gender. This allowed the queer themes to breathe without being dismissed as jokes or stereotypes. The strange truth is that Interview with the Vampire may be one of the earliest mainstream studio films to present a queer family structure without apology. Before we explore the remaining chapters, here are the first 5 strange facts about the queer themes hidden inside this gothic classic.
Thank you for all I have to learn from.
Fact 1. The entire story begins with queer domestic life between Louis and Lestat. One of the most important queer facts about the film is that the story opens with Louis and Lestat entering what is essentially a supernatural marriage. Louis moves into Lestat's home, shares his life, and becomes part of a 2-person household that mirrors a romantic partnership in every way except name. Anne Rice acknowledged that this relationship was inspired in part by her own fascination with queer intimacy and the idea of love that does not fit into traditional boxes. The film preserved nearly all of this emotional structure, even though the studio avoided marketing it that way. Critics who examine the film years later have pointed out how queer the domestic scenes truly are. There is a shared loneliness, emotional dependency, resentment, and the kind of intense attachment usually found in troubled romantic relationships. None of it is played for shock value. It is simply part of the world. This quiet, lived-in queer foundation is one of the strangest facts about the film because it appeared on screen in 1994, long before studios were comfortable addressing queer couples in a serious and dramatic way.
It's a coffin! Well, so it is. You must be dead.
Fact 2. The film shows Louis and Lestat raising Claudia as a queer family. The moment Claudia enters the story, Louis and Lestat transform from lovers locked in conflict into reluctant queer parents. The film never uses the language of adoption, but that is exactly what happens. 2 men who already share a household suddenly take on a responsibility for a child they did not plan for. This creates one of the earliest portrayals of a queer family structure in a mainstream studio film. Claudia's presence forces Louis and Lestat into parental roles that resemble a complicated marriage filled with disagreements over discipline, affection, and emotional needs. This queer family dynamic is one of the strangest facts in the film because it mirrors real tensions in blended families and non-traditional households. Some critics later noted that the 3 of them function like a dark mirror of the American family unit. Louis plays the tender and emotional parent. Lestat plays the glamorous and unpredictable one. Claudia becomes the child caught between 2 adults who love her yet cannot stop fighting. The result is a queer family portrait that feels raw, unstable, and unforgettable.
Why do you do this? I like to do it. I enjoy it.
Fact 3. Anne Rice confirmed that Louis was originally written as a queer character. Anne Rice openly stated in interviews that she created Louis as a queer character. In the novel, Louis feels a deep attraction to Lestat and forms a bond with him that reads as romantic rather than platonic. The film preserves this queer tension even though the screenplay softens some of the more direct moments from the book. Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise leaned into the emotional intimacy during filming, and neither performer treated the relationship as subtext. They approached Louis and Lestat as 2 beings tied together by desire, power, and centuries of emotional dependence. This makes the portrayal even more interesting in hindsight. The film was released during a time when studios feared openly queer characters would alienate audiences. Yet the emotional bond between Louis and Lestat is impossible to ignore. Fans recognized it immediately, and academic writing on the film often cites this relationship as one of the clearest early examples of queer representation in mainstream Gothic cinema. That steady acknowledgement is part of what keeps the film culturally alive today.
Pluck out the pain and give you another life.
Fact 4. The queer tension between Louis and Lestat was so strong that some audiences assumed it was intentional romance. Even without explicit romantic scenes, many viewers believed that Louis and Lestat were lovers because the queer energy between them was so intense. Their arguments have the rhythm of a couple in crisis. Their quiet moments look like intimate domestic scenes. Their grief over Claudia resembles the sorrow of two parents losing a child. Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt both chose to play their characters with subtle longing and emotional vulnerability, which made the queer themes feel natural rather than theatrical. This odd fact has been discussed by film scholars who argue that the movie functions as a coded queer romance disguised inside a vampire narrative. According to several critiques, the film's refusal to treat their relationship as a joke or an exaggeration helped push queer subtext into mainstream cinema. Instead of relying on stereotypes, the film gave viewers a serious and emotionally layered queer partnership, presented with dignity and dramatic weight. Fact 5. The film's queer tension was enhanced by what the studio removed, not just what it included. One of the queer facts that most fans do not realize is that the studio made significant cuts to the screenplay to reduce the obvious romantic connection between Louis and Lestat. Early drafts contained more explicit emotional exchanges and scenes that hinted more directly at their attraction. Even with these cuts, the queer energy between the characters remained strong enough that viewers still sensed it immediately. The performances, the cinematography, and the atmosphere did the work without needing overt dialogue. This created a strange effect. By trying to soften the queer elements, the studio unintentionally made the film even more intriguing. Fans began reading between the lines, noticing every shared glance and emotional shift. Critics later wrote that the restraint gave the film an elegance that set it apart from other vampire stories. Instead of sensationalizing queer desire, the film allowed it to simmer in silence, which made the tension far more powerful. Fact 6. Brad Pitt's performance makes Louis one of the most clearly queer characters in 90s cinema. Brad Pitt approached Louis as a character driven by longing, grief, and emotional dependency, and many of those traits deepen the queer themes woven through the film. Louis is portrayed as someone searching for connection and identity in a world that does not accept him, which mirrors queer narratives found in classic Gothic literature. His relationship with Lestat feels intimate and complex rather than purely adversarial. Their dynamic is filled with tension that plays out like a troubled queer romance caught between desire and resentment. Some scholars later wrote that Brad Pitt's portrayal of Louis introduced mainstream audiences to a quiet and introspective queer hero long before Hollywood felt comfortable exploring these stories openly. They argued that Louis carries the emotional weight typically placed on the romantic lead. His yearning for freedom and understanding becomes a queer-coded journey that resonates with viewers who see themselves in characters who navigate love and isolation outside traditional norms. Fact 7. Antonio Banderas and Brad Pitt created a queer subtext that fans still discuss decades later. When Louis meets Armand, the film shifts into one of its most openly queer moments. Antonio Banderas delivers his lines with a soft intensity that suggests fascination, desire, and admiration all at once. Armand clearly wants Louis, and the camera lingers on their interactions just long enough to highlight the attraction. Their scenes unfold with slow, deliberate tension, creating a relationship that feels like a seduction even though nothing explicit is said. Fans and writers have noted for years that the queer chemistry between Louis and Armand rivals even the energy between Louis and Lestat. The film frames Armand as someone who sees Louis as a potential companion, maybe even a partner, and his attempts to draw Louis into his world feel deeply romantic. This queer subtext adds another dimension to the story by showing Louis as someone who attracts desire from multiple directions, creating a layered portrayal of queer connection that is rare in early 90s cinema. Fact 8. The vampire world in the film operates outside traditional gender and relationship norms. making it naturally queer. One of the queer truths of Interview with the Vampire is that the vampires live outside human expectations of gender roles, partnership, and social structures. They do not marry, reproduce, or follow any recognizable pattern of romantic attachment. Instead, they form bonds based on intimacy, obsession, shared hunger, and emotional need. This creates a world where queer relationships feel natural rather than exceptional. The film exists in a space where queer desire does not need explanation. This fluid approach to identity has been the subject of many academic studies. Scholars often highlight the film as a rare 90s blockbuster where characters live in a space free from the rules that define human relationships. This makes Interview with the Vampire a deeply queer narrative without ever needing explicit labeling. By removing traditional structures, the film allows Louis, Lestat, Claudia, and Armand to exist in forms of connection that mirror queer experience without reducing their relationships to subtext alone. Fact 9. The queer undertones were so strong that LGBTQ audiences claimed the film as their own. When the film was released, queer audiences immediately embraced it. They saw in Louis and Lestat a queer couple navigating immortality together. They saw in Claudia the experience of someone who does not fit into the world she is forced to inhabit. They saw in Armand the seductive pull of a new life with someone who sees you clearly. Viewers recognized the queer themes long before critics were willing to discuss them openly. Many queer fans describe the film as one of the only mainstream stories that reflected their emotional experiences during a time when representation was limited. This connection helped the film build a devoted following. Over the years, queer communities have kept the movie alive through discussions, forums, essays, and fan interpretations. Some writers even argue that the film belongs more to queer audiences than to mainstream culture because the emotional language of the story reflects the complexity of queer relationships. This makes the strong queer reception one of the most fascinating and enduring facts about the film's legacy. Fact 10. The film's most intense conflicts are built on queer emotional dynamics rather than traditional villainy. Interview with the Vampire does not follow the usual structure of good versus evil. Instead, the conflicts come from jealousy, desire, fear of abandonment, and emotional entanglement. These are classic queer dynamics found in literature where relationships are complicated by longing and secrecy. Lestat wants control. Louis wants freedom. Armand wants connection. Claudia wants a life that does not imprison her. These emotional battles drive the story more than physical danger or traditional horror. This approach gives the film a level of emotional realism that critics praised in later analyses. Instead of presenting vampire relationships as exaggerated or monstrous, the film treats them with seriousness and depth. The result is a queer emotional ecosystem where the characters are bound to each other through love, resentment, and need. This queer complexity is one of the strangest facts about the movie because it transforms a gothic horror story into a dramatic exploration of connection and identity. Fact 11. Louis' queer longing shapes his entire journey through the story. Louis spends most of the film searching for connection, and that search is filled with queer longing. He cannot find comfort in human relationships, and he feels drawn to Lestat in a way that blends desire, resentment, and emotional need. His struggle reflects a queer experience of feeling out of place in the world he was born into. Instead of giving him a traditional romance, the story places him inside a complicated bond with someone who both comforts and imprisons him. This queer tension makes Louis one of the most emotionally complex characters in the film. Critics looking back at the movie often point to Louis as a rare example of a mainstream male character whose vulnerability is tied to another man, rather than a female love interest. The result is a queer-coded hero whose inner conflict gives the story its heartbeat. Fact 12. Lestat uses seduction and control in a way that feels deeply queer. Lestat's relationship with Louis is built on power, charm, and desire. He persuades Louis to join him not through force but through emotional seduction. This kind of persuasion has long been linked to queer-coded villains in Gothic stories, but Interview with the Vampire presents it more as intimacy rather than manipulation. Lestat wants Louis as a partner, not just a companion, and the film shows this through their shared home, shared feeding rituals, and shared parenting of Claudia. This queer dynamic made Lestat one of the most discussed characters when the film released. Over time, fans and scholars recognize that his charm does not fit into traditional masculine archetypes. His flamboyance, elegance, and emotional intensity give him a queer presence that shapes nearly every scene he appears in. Fact 13. Armand's attraction to Louis introduces a clear queer triangle. When Armand enters the story, a new layer of queer energy appears. He watches Louis with fascination, speaks softly to him, and tries to convince him to join his world. This attention forms a quiet competition between Armand and Lestat, creating a triangle built on desire and emotional ownership. The film never states this outright, but Armand's intention is unmistakable. This queer triangle became a popular topic among fans who interpreted Armand's desire as one of the film's strongest romantic threads. His offer to Louis is not just companionship, but a promise of emotional freedom. This hint of attraction adds another dimension to Louis' journey, making the queer themes richer and harder to ignore. Fact 14. Claudia's story resembles a queer metaphor about being trapped in a role you did not choose. Claudia's suffering is often interpreted through a queer lens. She lives in a body that cannot change, cannot grow, and cannot express the identity she feels inside. Many viewers saw her experience as a metaphor for queer people who feel trapped in labels that do not match their true selves. Claudia wants agency over her life, but Louis and Lestat control every part of her existence. This queer reading became more common over time, especially as modern critics revisited the story. They noted that Claudia's frustration mirrors the emotional reality of those who feel misunderstood by society. Her anger, rebellion, and longing for a different life deepen the film's queer narrative. Fact 15. The theater of vampires adds one of the film's strongest queer aesthetics. When Louis and Claudia travel to Paris, the theater of vampires introduces a world filled with theatricality, sensuality, and fluid roles. The performers flirt with gender presentation, blending masculinity and femininity with ease. This makes the theater one of the clearest queer spaces in the film. The vampires treat performance as identity, shifting personas as naturally as they feed. This queer aesthetic sets the Paris scenes apart from the rest of the movie. Critics later pointed out that the theater functions as a hidden queer society, complete with its own rules, rituals, and dangers. It becomes a place where queer-coded characters thrive, making it one of the most visually striking parts of the story. Fact 16. The film's queer energy comes through most clearly in its moments of silence. Some of the most powerful queer moments in Interview with the Vampire come from scenes where the characters do not speak at all. Louis and Lestat share long stretches of quiet tension that feel like the pauses inside a broken relationship. The way they look at each other says more than any dialogue could. These silent interactions show dependence, hurt, and unresolved desire, all of which have become classic markers of queer and coded storytelling. This quiet approach was unusual for mainstream films of the 90s. Critics later noted that the movie allows queer emotion to exist without exposition. Instead of announcing their feelings, the characters show them through presence and stillness. These small moments make the story feel more intimate and give the queer themes a depth that grows with every rewatch. Fact 17. Lestat's jealousy toward Louis feels like queer relationship drama. Lestat is one of the most jealous characters in the film, and that jealousy carries strong queer energy. He reacts emotionally whenever Louis pulls away, and he grows furious when Louis cares for Claudia more than him. This is not villain behavior as much as it is the frustration of someone afraid of losing a partner. The film frames Lestat's reactions like the emotional spirals of a troubled romance. Many viewers have pointed out that Lestat's jealousy feels familiar to anyone who has experienced a controlling or passionate queer relationship. He wants Louis close, but he does not know how to express vulnerability. This emotional turbulence adds another layer to the film's queer complexity and makes their partnership feel painfully real. Fact 18. The film treats queer desire with seriousness instead of stereotypes. One of the most important queer qualities of the movie is its refusal to treat queer desire as a joke. In the early 90s, many films used queer-coded characters for humor or villainy. Interview with the Vampire takes a different approach. It shows Louis and Lestat as two beings bound together through deep emotion, anger, affection, and a form of love that does not fit human categories. Their closeness shapes the entire story without mockery or exaggeration. This respectful tone helped the film gain admiration from queer audiences who were used to being reduced to stereotypes on screen. The movie presented queer dynamics with beauty and tragedy, allowing viewers to see themselves in characters who were complex and emotionally rich. Fact 19. Queer themes helped the film gain a cult following that grew over decades. While the film performed well during its release, it became even more popular over time because queer viewers kept the story alive. They discussed the characters in forums, wrote essays, shared interpretations, and treated the relationships as a meaningful part of queer cinema. This growing interest turned the film into a cult classic that younger generations continued to embrace. The queer reading of the movie is so strong that new audiences often discover the film through queer commentary online. The emotional honesty, the unconventional family, and the longing between the characters all resonate with people who rarely saw themselves in major studio films during the 90s. This continued devotion is one of the most surprising queer facts about the movie's legacy. Fact 20. The film creates a queer lesson about chosen bonds instead of biological ties. One of the deepest queer themes in Interview with the Vampire is the idea of chosen family. Louis, Lestat, and Claudia come together not because they share blood, but because they share need. Their household forms through emotion, pain, and connection rather than biology. This mirrors the queer experience of building communities outside traditional family structures. The idea of chosen bonds gives the story its emotional power. The characters fight, love, betray, and mourn each other with the intensity of family, even though none of them were meant to belong together. This theme remains one of the film's most powerful queer elements and has helped keep the story relevant for 3 decades. Bonus fact: the queer reading was so strong that Anne Rice herself embraced it. Anne Rice often spoke about the queer themes in Interview with the Vampire, and she confirmed that the emotional bonds between her characters were intentionally fluid and intimate. She said that the vampires existed outside the limits of gender and traditional romance, and that their relationships were meant to reflect a kind of love that does not depend on human rules. This gave the novel and the film a queer openness that viewers immediately recognized. Over the years, Anne Rice became proud of how queer audiences embraced the story. She spoke about receiving letters from fans who saw themselves in Louis' longing, in Lestat's intensity, and in Claudia's sense of being trapped between identities. This acceptance from the author helped cement the film as a cornerstone of queer Gothic cinema. It confirmed that the emotional tension viewers felt was not accidental, but an essential part of the story's DNA. Interview with the Vampire remains one of the most quietly daring studio films of the 90s. It delivered a world filled with desire, loneliness, and connection, all built on relationships that exist outside ordinary human expectations. The film's queer themes are woven into every part of its story, from Louis' longing to Lestat's jealousy to Armand's fascination and Claudia's rebellion. These threads form a tapestry that continues to resonate with viewers who understand what it feels like to live outside imposed rules and traditional ideas of love. 3 decades later, the film still finds new audiences because it carries a truth that never fades. It shows how chosen bonds can shape a family, how desire can cross every boundary, and how queer stories can exist inside mainstream cinema even when the world is not ready to name them. That is why this dark, beautiful story continues to hold its place in film history. If you want more strange truths buried in cinema history, like and subscribe. This is Strange Flick Facts, where we uncover the bizarre truths behind your favorite films.